Hi, everybody. I think we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I hope everybody can see me. Welcome to the roundtable on Sudan. I'm really happy to have you all with me. This is a series of roundtable discussions that we are organizing as France Insoumis in the UK. Our idea is to give an understanding of different struggles across the world and support in solidarity the resistance and the movements that different people under this conflicts have created. So today I'm joined by a wonderful panel entirely made up of really interesting Sudanese experts. We have Sarah Abbas, who is going to come online. She is a feminist and a political scientist, active with the Sudanese revolution across Europe. She has written on the Sudanese politics for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and The Nation magazine. And recently, she's completed a fellowship where she researched the Sudan's December Revolution and life-saving mutual aid infrastructure in the conflict. And I have come across this wonderful lady over a year ago, and I'm delighted to have her on the panel. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
We have Mohamed El Naim, the founder and director of the Decolonial Center. He has intervened on numerous media and numerous platforms on Sudan. The Decolonial Center is a project of the Pluto Educational Trust. They are a political education platform that's committed to spreading anti-colonial and decolonial perspective on history, social theory, and current affairs. They champion decolonial thinking, advocate for social justice, and inspire collective action towards decolonization. Welcome, Mohammed. And finally, we have Maz Salih Idris, the Local Action Fund manager at Peace Direct, a London-based charity that works with partners in conflict-affected areas. He provides strategic leadership, managing their portfolio, and supporting grassroots peace-building efforts. He's a Sudanese leader who has an unwavering dedication to finding a locally led solution to global challenges. Thank you, everyone, for having accepted to join us tonight. I thought we would start to introduce this talk with a bit of a sense seater to make sure that everybody understands what's actually going on in Sudan, because I'm quite sure not everybody is going to know. So I'm going to turn to Maz to start with. And the idea would be, could you let our audience know what is going on in Sudan? Who are the main conflict parties? What do you think is driving the conflict? What is preventing its resolution? And we're going to put up a map on the screen just for people to understand who is controlling what bit of the territory. But yeah, Maz, over to you. And then Mohammed and Sarah, you can add as much as you want.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. And thank you also for my fellow Sudanese and people who joined and all the solidarity. For Sudan and for Sudanese, it's really important conversations and awareness raising, really. I'm not by any means an expert on politics, but it's a lived experience. It's a sort of connections, deep connections with Sudanese civil society and grassroots organizations through my work and subsequently my family and friends who are in Sudan. So this is really important to kind of highlight. I mentioned that I worked with Sudanese civil society organizations that works in Sudan and also in exile. And it's important just to highlight why I feel like there is an important kind of conversation that we need to have around the role of these groups. But to kind of tune into your questions about who are the actors, who are, what is the sort of root causes of this conflict, who are fighting, just to highlight two major groups, two military groups. One is the Sudanese Armed Forces, known as SAF. The second is a paramilitary groups called Rapid Support Forces, known as RSF. The fight is mainly around the struggle around power and gaining a dominance over territories. At the moment, the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, seems to be holding grounds and gaining momentum and advancing in Khartoum and other regions. But also the situation is unpredictable because both have been backed by regional and external actors. So to give you a very specific answer, the situation is very unpredictable. Depends on media propaganda, certain kind of report that came out, who are advancing military, who are gaining momentum. But we know that RSF have essentially sieged majority of Khartoum and Darfur and South and Kordofan areas, and these armies equally have been also advancing in Khartoum and gaining sort of military kind of geographical territories. So yeah, essentially the struggle or the fight is around political dominance, power, and geographical sort of dominance. But it's not only that, it's only a fight on resources, Sudan's resources, who control these resources, who position themselves and accumulate much power within that political atmosphere.
Thanks, Maz. Mohammed or Sarah, do you want to add anything before we go even further back in the origins of this conflict and look at the Sudanese revolution? Do you want to add anything? Go ahead, Mohammed, if you want to add something. Oh, no. Okay. Right. Okay. So then I really wanted to take it back to the origins. One thing that I think most of the people will not know is that the leaders of the current conflict parties in the past actually joined forces, and they joined forces to defeat the civilian government that the people brought to power after they toppled Beshir. And Mohammed, one of the reasons why I was very interested in having you on the panel, and I don't know if you coined the term, but I know that when I heard you say that on one of the Novara media, I thought, oh God, this guy is so spot on. You call this a counter-revolutionary war. This is how you call the current conflict. And I think that is a lens that we're completely missing in the Western media coverage of this conflict, but is a critical lens. So I would really want you to explain to us what you mean by counter-revolutionary war. And then I would like to turn to Sarah, who can tell us where she thinks the Sudanese revolution movement is at now, and what the kind of relationship it has with the political forces that Western powers are supporting. But let's start with you, Mohammed. This counter-revolutionary war. Could you unpack this for our audience?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Just to clarify, I don't believe that I was the one who coined the term. I've heard it a lot from a lot of comrades, including Sarah and others who I'm always learning from. But the main point is this, that back in the late 2018, early 2019, Sudanese people rose up in a revolution and overthrew the 30-year dictatorship of Umar al-Bashir. The demand of the people on the ground was for a transition into a civilian democracy. And throughout that process, the biggest force against the transition to democracy were the Rapid Support Forces and the SAF, the two groups which are now fighting. They were, as far as the vast majority of the Sudanese people were concerned, one bloc and the biggest obstacle to a transition to a full civilian democracy, which was an aspiration and a cause that many of the martyrs in our revolution fought for. Despite the fact that many martyrs were killed throughout the process, the transition period, which was mediated by international powers, was imperfect in the sense that international powers were almost compelled Sudan to enter into a framework agreement or a peace agreement between the civilian camps and the military camp. And at the time, civilian elite politicians claimed that this was a unique partnership, which would be a model to the world. But that was the beginning, I think, for many Sudanese people of the process which would lead to the end of the aspirations for civilian democracy. There was a sit-in where civilian forces, civil society, resistance committees, and different groups of progressive organizations, as well as just the vast majority of Sudanese people, there were multiple sit-ins in both the peripheries and in Khartoum, which were trying to push the pressure for a full transition into civilian democracy. But on June 3rd, 2019, the military and the rapid support forces did a horrific massacre. And that massacre, the civil pressures that led on after that, civil disobedience, strikes, mass protests, led to an inevitable partnership between the military and the military forces and the civilian elite politicians. The reason why I say this then is because throughout this transition period, the idea was that inevitably there would be a transition to full civilian democracy. I mean, this was what was told to Sudanese people, and it was what was told to the elites. But throughout that before that could even happen, both the rapid support forces and the SAF engaged in a coup against that government, and led a coup government very much up until the war which we led. And the reason why then we say that this is a counter-revolutionary war is because the aspirations of the people, specifically led by civil society groups, and explicitly we could say the resistance committees, which were very powerful groups of people, their demand was quite straightforward. We want a full transition to civilian democracy, a dissolution of the rapid support forces, and for the army to return to the barracks. Because their experience throughout the revolutionary period was that the rapid support forces and the military were one bloc that was against the aspirations of the revolutionary people. And so in one way to understand the war between the rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces is that this is a family affair gone wrong. These are two different parties with huge rentier interests, which means they have the exclusive monopoly over certain kinds of resources. For example, the rapid support forces in gold, and the military in various parastatal companies. That the rapid support forces itself is a product of the military, once a junior partner, but which only became powerful enough to stand on equal footing to the military due to international patronage, due to international partnerships with groups, including the European Union, but the United Arab Emirates and others who they sold gold for. And this is an experience which parallels what we see in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. And this Frankenstein monster was only able to become equivalent to the military because of international patronage. But in general, this is a family affair of two different armed groups who hold exclusive monopoly over certain resources. And instead of one dissolving into the other under an internationally mediated agreement, they chose instead to burn the entire country to the ground than to concede to any of the material resources which each party held. And so then to understand this then is that this is not just a war between two warring sides. There is no false choice between, say, for example, one legitimate party and the other illegitimate militia. This is a group of two different groups of people who once shared their monopoly of violence over the territories of Sudan, but who ended up fighting against each other because neither wanted to give up their exclusive resources, the exclusive domination, and both had their interests against revolution, a popular revolution, which was built on the premise of wealth redistribution and on social justice, on peace, and bread for everybody.
Thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, I very much have that impression from hearing you in reading up about Sudan, that this is really the revolution being stolen from the Sudanese people, and that wonderful, very brave process that was started being completely hijacked in So, Sarah, do you want to add anything to this context and maybe tell us a little bit where these resistance committees are? They have become, I think, a lifeline of support, but I guess the revolution movement has been extremely badly hit by everything that's going on. What is the kind of prospect of trying to reveal them, or what's their future in the middle of this situation?
Sure. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm unmuted. So I feel very aligned with what Mohammed said, because I think I really agree with his take, and I think it's kind of interesting that I think strategically there has been a move, at least in the social media space and the kind of media space, to talk about Sudan as a proxy war, and I think that there is some truth in that, particularly when you look at the UAE role. The United Arab Emirates' role in the conflict, and particularly in supporting the rapid support forces. That makes sense, that the RSF is largely funded and supported by the United Arab Emirates, amongst others. I think we will talk a little bit more about that later, so I won't get into it. I really agree with Mohammed that often in the analysis of what's happening in Sudan, the economic or the political economic dimension gets left out. As he said so clearly, these are not just militarized political actors, these are economic actors. Between the two of them, they monopolize the Sudanese economy on behalf of global capitalism. And I think this is a really, really important point. This is a struggle over resources as much as it is a struggle over government or governance. I think you asked me kind of the question I was not prepared for in a way, which doesn't make sense when you look at the topic. And I don't think either of my panelists would want the question of where is the revolution today? It's a very difficult, painful question to speak about. I think what's important to say is that there is a kind of tendency, and this is a colonial tendency, that when a war happens or this type of thing happens, there is an erasure of the histories prior to it. So in a similar way that the Arab Spring was spoken about as if there had never been any social movements in the Arab region or the Middle East region prior to the Arab Spring. It was like the beginning of history. So often war and the intention of war is that it becomes the beginning of history, in the sense that it's an attempt, as Mohammed said so clearly, it's a counter-revolutionary attempt to kind of render long and deep and historic processes of emancipation and of resistance irrelevant. So just to sort of start to answer this question, I would say that the revolutionary movement is in crisis in Sudan. I would not say that it's dead, but it's in a deep crisis. And this was the intention by large of this war, is to put that process, to interrupt that process, and to essentially end that process, and also a way for the military regime of Sudan to reassert itself along nationalist lines and along particular ideas of, liberating territories and so forth. Territories that they themselves have, of course, as Mohammed has said, they themselves have been attacking many parts of this territory for many generations, actually. So if you're from South Sudan or from Darfur, the war is not new. You have experienced war in the Nuba Mountains, you have experienced war in Blue Nile, in Darfur, and in South Sudan, going back to the year prior to the actual foundation of the modern Sudanese state in 1956. So I think this is a very important point. What the war has done is that it has taken one of the main tools of the revolutionary movement away, which is the streets. And it did that, of course, through this enforcement of an incredible level of violence that makes it, of course, extremely difficult to, for example, mobilize on the streets in the way that it was possible to do prior to April 2023 in many places. It's not, you can never speak of Sudan as everywhere, because there was an intense level of violence in many places, but it took away the streets, it took away it displaced people, it displaced activists, and that also, it took away means of communication between people through attacks on the internet, attacks on infrastructure. It did what we are very used to in Sudan, which is that the state violence, what it does is it gets people in such a deep economic and social crisis that the intention is to get people so busy trying to survive, to just secure themselves from meal to meal, that it becomes more difficult to politically organize. I also don't think it's an accident that the war began in April. I mean, there's many factors. It doesn't come down to one factor. But I think, it's very important to remember that in January of 2023, only 3 months prior to the beginning of this war, the resistance committees and other revolutionary bodies who had been engaged for, a year, writing the revolutionary charter, a charter that would really lay out a vision of how to bring power to the people, rather than what the movement is against, but what the movement concretely sees. This charter, which was a long process, it took place in most of the states in Sudan. It took place at the grassroots level. This charter was issued in January, and there were some things starting to happen that were very important in terms of kind of alternative governance structures that the revolutionary movement had, sparked. So I think the revolution is there in the sense that many of the slogans, the activists, many of the charter itself is still there as a vision, which I notice is often really ignored when we talk about peacemaking and kind of a political settlement in Sudan. What should we do? And always the discussion is about having the militarized actors sit around the table in a closed mediation process and reaching an agreement that is then, sold to the people. And I think we know that from the revolutionary movement, there is a vision that is much more grassroots and built on a lot of work within communities. And that is never mentioned, at least when it comes to the international actors when it relates to the revolution. So there is also a polarization that happened within the movement. I mean, I don't think we can ignore it. It's a kind of difficult thing to talk about, but because many of the activists that are within bodies, revolutionary bodies from the period 2018 or even earlier and on, because many of them are in areas that have been occupied by the RSF, that experienced very intense violence from the RSF, economic violence, denial of infrastructure, basic rights, also sexual violence against women. I think I'll talk about that a little bit later. Basically, there has been so some of those activists have actually, volunteered to fight the RSF. So there is a kind of sense when you have conversation with these activists, it's not that they support the military, but they see right now that they need to liberate these particular territories from the RSF, and that kind of fight is delayed, but it's not over, right? And so this, of course, there's a general deep polarization happening within the revolutionary movement and also within the civil society space as well. The ways that it's working is it's pulling people to take a position in relation to the warring parties, and this is not helped by the fact that the media has almost disappeared. Independent media, I mean, it's very much still under attack. People have, media bodies have lost their infrastructure. Most of what we see as supposed media now is actually propaganda by the two sides, by the SAF, the military, and by the RSF, and this is further adding to these kinds of discourses. So I don't think I really answered your question. Maybe I danced around it a little bit, but it's a difficult question. And I think it's an ongoing conversation that we're having. But I think what's important with this panel is that it's very important constantly to reassert that there is a legacy. There is an actual very long and also very recent history of organizing, of revolution, of a vision, and that this should not be thrown off the table simply because, these two parties, as Mohammed has said, have burned the country to the ground.
Thank you, Sarah. Very, very powerful. Thank you so much. Maz, do you want to add, Maz or Mohammed, but
yeah.
Mohammed and Sarah, do you want to add anything to what Sarah and Mohammed have said?
Yes, I think, both Mohammed and Sarah have beautifully stated and took us back to the kind of counter-revolutionary. And I think the way that I look at the crisis right now, the war in Sudan now, is not just about this war or about this particular crisis. It's the latest stage of counter-revolutionary war. That's what we're witnessing now, that is being influenced by RSF, the South, and external factors as well, as we will kind of address later. And it will continue. It will continue to shape the future, the political future of Sudan for many years to come as well. But Sarah also spoke beautifully about the role of the revolutionary, the resistance committees, and these are the ones who are on the front line defending, responding to these crises. So if anything, that shows how resilient the revolutionary kind of movement is in Sudan, and what is happening now. We see the situations, the crisis is dire, and there is all of that. But we also see a lot of alliance and movement building and resilience that is being demonstrated by Sudanese resistance movement and community in general.
Thank you, everybody. And so you've all talked about this, and we thought we would spend a bit of time at this stage about kind of outlining the regional and the global factors that are feeding this conflict, the different actors that we know are playing a key role. So I'm turning to whoever wants. I know Sarah definitely wants to tell us about the European Union's border policy, which I think is a fascinating angle that's often completely overlooked. But Maza or Mohammed, do you want to tell us a bit about this, the regional or global powers that are driving, sustaining, feeding the current conflict and the interests that animate them?
Mohammed, do you want to go first?
Oh, you said I go first or you go first?
You go first, sorry, if you want.
Okay.
Yeah. Up to you.
It's okay if you could go first.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will. I think, yeah, there is, as we know and as we have kind of hinted, the role of regional and international actors within the conflict in Sudan is very, very obvious. And at the moment, it's mainly centered around supporting the both military fighting parties. So let's just start with the role of the regional actors. So you've got the UAE, which is playing a massive role in financially supporting the RSF and backing them. And you need to understand also what is their interest, what is the dynamic, to understand the reason and the rationale behind backing RSF. It's mainly around supporting the RSF financially, military, and there is a clear evidence and investigations on these areas of showing the UAE involvement within this sort of conflict, and that is mainly to reach out to the gold and resources within that RSF in Sudan had their hands on for many years, and that's what allowed them to accumulate that kind of power and militarizations. Their interest is not only just about these resources, so it's also geopolitics. So you see Emirates is also trying to insert itself within the Horn of Africa, and Sudan is a very strategic country to do that. So that's also a geopolitics country within that. We've got Egypt. Egypt is also playing a major role in backing SAF, the Sudanese armed forces. And that also has a political and security mainly kind of and geopolitics reasons. Egypt think that the Sudanese armed forces are sort of the legitimate power that will sustain security within the region and vis-a-vis Egypt's safety and security. And that includes the Nile water, that includes any trade and its safety. So that has been mainly supporting that, whether it's military, whether it's intelligence and logistics and all of that. There is also Chad, which is also hosting many Sudanese displaced people, or let's call it refugees crossing the borders. But that's also very specific to the RSF. Hemeti has a strong ethnic ties to Chad, and the sort of connections and that particular regions represent a political kind of incubator that allows RSF once to military mobilize and recruit soldiers. That's their supply chain within West Africa to get their weapons and all of that. So it's quite strategic, and they have, it's very fragile, long borders with Chad, between Chad and Sudan. So that's also quite strategic to that. There is also other actors. You've got the UK, the US, and I think Sarah will state this will highlight that really, kind of nicely and in depth. But just to say that the engagement with the US and the UK, and I work with civil society trying to influence UK government, US Senate, all of that, and opening advocacy avenues. understanding that their engagement is really weak and being criticized many times. So just before the conflict started, they have focused on diplomatic policies, try to engage with the RSF, try to support both of them to kind of assert their dominance, but not particularly to support the revolution, to civil society, to advance the sort of civil government and the revolution's agenda. So their support was mainly to that. And they've been criticized as well for legitimizing the RSF. For example, there was like a high officials who met the RSF, trying to engage with them diplomatically and politically, knowing that the RSF have been, there's a confirmed report of them committing mass sexual assaults and genocides in Sudan. So that's engaging with them without addressing this is also legitimizing these powers. Their engagement, all the US and UK engagements, have also mainly centered around talking with the Sudanese elites and men with arms. And that's completely distort the idea of civil society, of supporting this grassroots and give them the legitimacy, the agency to access decision-making space. And those are the ones who are on the front line, responding to humanitarian aids, building movement, mobilizing people. And important to mention that these are working in Sudan, but also in exile. So their strategies in Sudan are really, really weak and have been criticized by civil society a lot of time on how they have mainly centered around talking to men with guns and the people who are elite. And that's also, to me, perpetuate this kind of colonial mentality of just engaging with the elite and just ignoring a huge margins of Sudanese civil society who are engaged and ready to talk.
Thank you. Mohammed, I see you nodding a lot. Do you want to add anything to?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with everything that was said. And, you know, it can actually kind of get dizzying how many international and external forces are actually involved in Sudan. And so instead of kind of just listing them out, maybe sometimes it's good to kind of categorize why, right? Why did the RSF go from a small force of maybe 3,000, 5,000 in 2013 to by 2020 being a force of 100, 150,000? And that's because of international patronage. And there's no way to understand this without understanding the movement of resources and the need for armed people, right? So we could justify it with brawn, metal, and wheat, just in a certain kind of way. Brawn, quite simply, you want mercenaries. Well, if the UAE wants mercenaries, or Libya, Haftar, which has its relationship with the French government, wants resources, wants mercenaries, they can go to the RSF and the RSF gives it to them. If the European Union wants mercenaries to stop the flow of migration, the rapid support forces give it to them. There's a clientele relationship there. If the UAE and different countries want wheat, and they understand that to be able to extract wheat under ideal conditions, you need a militarized force to basically compel people to do that. The rapid support forces are good. The rapid support forces can hold certain kinds of land. If you are Russia, for example, and you're trying to evade sanctions by the regime and you need metal, you need access to hard metal, and like gold, the rapid support forces are a good base. On the other side, there's other forms of external interference. One of them could be, for example, diplomatic. An example is that during the transition period, during the partnership, one of the requirements for Sudan to be integrated into the global economy to get the much needed reserves so that it can support the transition was that the United States forced Sudan into a normalization agreement with Israel and reparations that Sudan, the new government, which overthrew the old government, was supposed to pay back to the United States, the same United States which was paying reparations to its own African-American population. And these are forms of economic blackmail. Then there's, of course, also the extension or proxy of the fact that if the European countries or the United States is providing weapons and selling weapons to the UAE and other regional actors which fuel the RSF, they are also complicit in that crime. And so the regular business dealings, the sports washing through things like Emirates, etc. All of this also forms different ways of external interference, which only fuel the conflict further. But I guess the most important thing is that it's the addiction to raw materials and metals. It's the addiction to cheap labor, which needs to be fed, which leads to the kinds of domination which makes the RSF and other groups, just like the M21 in the Democratic Republic of Congo, prosper and grow and become empowered. And so if you go even further, it's not just that this is a proxy war, because many people may be asking, well, why is Russia involved? Why is Turkey involved? Why is the UAE involved? It's actually because all of these are important nodes in a global capitalist system where Sudan needs to extract, it needs to have its resources extracted. And internal to Sudan as well, the reason why groups like the Rapid Support Forces exist in the first place is because the international global capitalist economy, which treats Sudan as a periphery that needs to be extracted from, internal to Sudan, we have the same dynamic of the riverine elites and Khartoum being kind of the center and the peripheries of the country needing to be extracted. And that's what led to the foundation of armed groups like Rapid Support Forces in the first place. It was the same thing. You need metal, you need wheat, you need brawn. Put down revolts in Darfur, you fund the Rapid Support Forces. You put down the, you use the Rapid Support Forces to extract resources and metal and gold, exactly the same dynamics. And so the Rapid Support Forces was already primed to become this international force, because the same way it dealt with the military, which support forces, it had already learned, it developed the business acumen, and it already developed its business model, which it ended up giving to the international forces, which led it to become this monster it is. And so it's also really important, again, to recognize the importance of the Sudanese armed forces in the creation of the Rapid Support Forces and in the creation of the social dislocation, but to never lose sight of the fact that, again, we're dealing with a global capitalist system which is addicted to natural resources. It's addicted to paying mercenaries to put down the problems which get caused because of resource extraction, like things like migration, things like rebellion, things like just people refusing to just allow their livelihoods to be taken away. And the root cause is therein as well.
Thank you, Mohammed. Fascinating. I can see a few questions in the chat. So just guys on the chat, I will ask them at the end. I'll group them. There's a few questions, so I've seen them. I just wanted to finish on this topic of global and regional support and have Sarah tell us about the role of the European Union border control policies. So over to you, Sarah, on this.
Okay, so I think it's been touched on already, actually, by both speakers, and I saw also a comment pop up on YouTube about it as well. I think it's just really to highlight what's already been said and just give a little bit of slightly more meat to it, because it's not sort of this. It's a very specific program that has resulted in support for the. I mean, the RSF would not exist today in the form that it does without this history with the European Union and the UK as well, because the UK is part of this process. So I'm going to try to keep it extremely short, but essentially it's just to highlight that, yeah, we talk about the different actors that are currently involved in the conflict and where the weapons are coming from and the support. But it is a question whether there would be a conflict to begin with if it wasn't for the European Union's, what are known as externalized borders in Africa. So as many of the people listening know, the European policy over the last period has been focused less on, essentially with also the rise of the right-wing rhetoric and the kind of really hard move to the right, and even towards fascism in some of the European states, a lot of the scapegoating has been of migrants, and specifically migrants from the Middle East and from Africa, and specifically sub-Saharan Africa, because of course these are the regions where a lot of the migration into Europe is coming from. And so a lot of the policies of the European Union have been about cutting deals across the region with different countries as a way of kind of warehousing migrants who are trying to reach the European Union because of the desperate situations that they're in. So we know, for example, with Turkey, there is a particular deal that had related to the Syrians. And in the context of our region, there is a program that was started in 2015. And the program is called actually it's called the Khartoum process. So from the beginning, the regime in Sudan was a central element of it. And just to remind the audience, in 2015, it was Omar al-Bashir in power. It was at the height of the dictatorship. This is prior to the revolution. And several other countries within the region, including Egypt and others, are also part of this Khartoum process. And the Khartoum process was framed as an attempt for something kind of a little bit Orwellian, like better migration or something like that. But actually, the purpose of it is to stop migrants from being able to reach the Mediterranean. And so essentially, its central element is that, it says that it's combating human trafficking. So that was kind of the official reason. But there's been several reports and research done by human rights organizations that show that actually a minuscule amount of the budget allocated towards that program went into establishing, let's say, better routes for migration, that the vast majority of it went into migration control. And within the context of Sudan, the RSF, the Rapid Support Force militia, exactly, better migration management, that's the name of the program, thank you. And within the context of Sudan, this was a period where also the Sudanese president felt like he needed some protection, potentially from his own military. There were a lot going on. And the Janjaweed militias that had been a central plank of the state's policy in Darfur, that played a massive role in the genocide that happened in Darfur starting 2003. There was a fallout with the leader of those Janjaweed militias, who then the RSF first iteration came out as border guards, actually, for the Sudanese regime. So their job was to guard specifically, in particular, the Libyan border, which is the border with Western Sudan and part of Northern Sudan as well. And so that's how the RSF began. And from that point, it was deployed to Yemen to also help fight under the so-called Saudi coalition in Yemen. They fought alongside the SAF. That's actually Hemeti and Burhan worked together in Yemen. They were deployed. They were also used in relation to Libya. And they started professionalizing, growing, and being brought also into Khartoum and other cities as a way of basically keeping down protests and committing violence. And so there is that history. And actually, this program ran into at least 2019. It was paused when the revolution was already happening, and it continued in different iterations. Also, there were discussions under the Hamdok government in the transitional period to make Sudan a kind of center for this kind of better migration management kind of program. So I think it's extremely critical to talk about this. I'll put it very simply, because whenever I speak about Sudan in Europe, there is always a perception that it has nothing to do with Europe, that all of this is about Africans fighting each other and so forth. But it's very important to understand that Sudan is in this situation in part because your governments, did this kind of collaborated with these regimes, with these armed forces in particular ways, and that there is a lot that you can do. And I think we'll talk about that a bit later. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. We're going to turn to the one before last, if that's how we say it, part, and really turning to the impact that this conflict has had on the Sudanese people. It is, at the moment, considered one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world. The numbers are immense. This is considered to have 30 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. There are millions being displaced, millions being acutely malnourished, health infrastructure that have been destroyed. So I think people would be interested in hearing a bit more, both about what the civilian population has had to go through, and about something that was touched upon a little earlier, but we didn't develop because we knew we were going to touch on it now. But the role of the resistance committees and the emergency response rooms and all of the frontline organizations that formed the kind of first line of support for the Sudanese population. So I would give it over to Sarah, then Maz, to tell us more about all of this, please.
Yeah. So yeah, it's there's a lot to say, unfortunately, because it's almost like becoming more and more difficult as this war progresses to find the language or to find the right adjectives, I would say, to describe, because the size of the humanitarian crisis is almost difficult for the human mind to comprehend. So it's one of those difficult things of how to speak about it, because if you start just giving statistics, I think people's minds just can't absorb the numbers and they glaze over. I think there are a couple of statistics I do want to say, and maybe I'll say them slowly because I feel like they always get lost. But you know, Sudan was recently declared by some humanitarian actors as the biggest humanitarian crisis on record. So, I mean, we can focus or not focus on that. I think there is always this is also a kind of colonial thing that countries like Sudan are put in a situation of almost having to fight for space or attention or something. And it can end up in this kind of not very helpful direction. But I think just quite simply, some of the elements of this massive humanitarian crisis is the displacement. So we'll start with this. At the moment, it is estimated that about 9 million people are displaced within the country. So I'll just say that again, 9 million people are displaced within Sudan, and about 3 million people have crossed a border into neighboring countries. So it is, when it comes to displacement, Sudan has the highest displacement of any place on earth right now. So this is the first element of that. The second element of it is, you've already mentioned it, Anais, it's like the level of hunger, I think, is also something that is really quite hard to describe when it comes to Sudan. 2/3 of the Sudanese population, and when I say the Sudanese population, I mean Sudanese citizens and non-citizens, because Sudan always hosted a very large number of also refugees from neighboring countries as well. And the 2/3 of the population is facing acute humanitarian needs. Some of that population, a very large number, is almost entirely dependent on aid for basic things like food and water and so forth. There are I think there's an intersectionality also to the conflict that's very important. So obviously the scale of it, there's almost no one that's not affected right now who is from Sudan or in Sudan by the conflict. It doesn't matter where they are. I think probably also my co-panelists, even in their own families, I mean, there's so many stories, but it is a fact that how you are positioned intersectionally matters a lot in how you experience this conflict or how it impacts you. So for example, several million people entered this conflict already, having been displaced by previous conflicts. So if you come from South Sudan, or you come from Darfur, or you come from the Nuba Mountains, or you come from Blue Nile, from areas that have been targeted by state violence and experienced war, you are likely to have already entered this conflict with very few resources, having been displaced at least once, if not multiple times before. Within this conflict itself, from April 2023, people have experienced multiple displacements. So, for example, if you're from Khartoum, like my family is, and you flee to Jazeera next door for safety, you try to somehow rebuild a life or find a way there, you are then displaced again when Jazeera is attacked by the RSF into, let's say, Sinnar or elsewhere. Sinnar is then attacked, and then you're displaced to Kassala. So people are experiencing these multiple dislocations and displacements. There is it's estimated that at least about 19 million children in Sudan are not in school. So a lot of the schools in Sudan, this is something, when I talk to my friends, they just they can't understand it, but many of the schools in Sudan have turned into shelters, into makeshift shelters to house the displaced. There's massive infrastructural damage. So there is, many of the hospitals, most of the hospitals and clinics, the infrastructure was already quite poor prior to the war, but what was there, at least 70% of it is no longer functional and hasn't been for a very long time. This is especially acute in Darfur, and I'm going to speak about Darfur. And for example, there's a city called Al-Fashir, which is the capital of North Darfur. And of course, Darfur has been in a genocidal war and a conflict for about 20 years when this war started. And Al-Fashir is under siege. That's not unlike Gaza, that has been going on for many, many months. And it's the only place left in Darfur that is not controlled by the RSF, and the SAF is holding it. And there's an attack on the city. And there's the last hospital left in Al-Fashir was recently bombed. And so there is this constant targeting of health infrastructure, workers, water infrastructure, electrical infrastructure. The extent of the infrastructural damage is extremely difficult to describe. So in the midst of all of this, there is incredible, I would say, there's a failure, first of all, an incredible failure from the so-called international community, which is, of course, mostly the countries with money, the countries that are former colonial countries. But there has been a real failure of response. And that's partly to do with some of the logistics and the kind of politics of Sudan. The military, which is, you could say, it's a kind of nominal government in Sudan, has made it very difficult to get humanitarian access, as has the RSF in the areas that it controls. There's been attacks on humanitarian workers. Of course, local humanitarian workers are the main workers because they're the ones there on the ground. Denial of visas, or just not processing visas of humanitarian workers from outside. All sorts of obstacles are put in the way. But there has also been, a failure of a kind of like recognition of the size and extent of the damage. So of course, Ukraine always comes up as an example of how to respond to a war. And in the case of Sudan, I mean, it has to be said that part of the failure in response, at least that's how we see it as Sudanese people, is a failure of a kind of a normalization of Black African death, right? So there is an element where, Black African death is just not treated the way death is treated in other regions, because it's seen as normalized, as normal. So what are all these figures? Who cares if 9 million people are displaced? So I think there's a failure of will that's kind of also rooted in these discourses and ideas about Blackness and about, the sanctity of life and who deserves to live. There is also an element of course, there is multiple crises across the world right now. So there is also a lot of, let's say, it's a horrible word to say, but like competition. There's, in a way, we are seeing a moment where there are multiple and, polycrises across the world. And that's also an element of it. Within all of this, I want to say that we talked about this a little bit earlier, but where I see a real, hope, or let's say, the kind of bright light in this is the ways that communities have come together across the country, and even sometimes in neighboring countries, to do mutual aid. I think most of the world is surviving through mutual aid, actually, not through the humanitarian aid, And so in the very early days, after Khartoum was hit and the war was expanding to other parts of the country, communities or activists got together and started, what they called emergency, local or neighborhood emergency rooms. And there's a kind of tradition of this, and there's a history of it. It didn't start with the war, but in a lot of these places, this was led by actually resistance committee members, local women and women's rights and feminist activists and others who got together and made these spaces to provide aid. A lot of the aid had to do with evacuation, depending on which part of the city it is. And it's evolved in trying to provide medical care or access to medicines, but also across the country right now, there are, we call them tekaya, like these, places where people, women and young people come together and cook and provide meals for the community, really using resources, mostly from within the community, but also some of them have been able to get some support from some of the humanitarian actors. And of course, where you are depends on the form that is happening. For example, there's 400,000 plus people that are in the camps across the border in Chad. And I think there's also a kind of a hierarchy and a difference between where you were displaced to if you crossed the border. So, some of the worst conditions are in Chad and South Sudan, for example, where there have been very little support, very little help. And some of the people that have been affected the most and have been most destitute have ended up across the border in those countries and just receiving very little support. The sexual violence aspect of the humanitarian conflict is really, really awful. I really urge feminists across the world to really rally for Sudan, because women and girls are in a situation in Sudan that is hard to describe. There is actually incredible work being done by feminist groups, women's groups, activists, many of whom are themselves displaced, to document some of this violence. And a lot of local initiatives have popped up to try to support women with reproductive health, with pads, supporting them in the shelters, supporting them with psychosocial counseling. But again, in a really deep situation of scarcity. So I'll leave it at this, because I could talk for the next 7 hours about it. It wouldn't be enough.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think you're completely right. I mean, I'm a humanitarian. I've been a humanitarian for 20 years. I can truly say that the scale and the severity of what's going on in Sudan is I wouldn't say it's unparalleled, because I don't like trying to, there's no championing, there's no competition of suffering across the world, but it is a severity that is very hard to fathom. And at the moment, what's breaking my heart is with the latest decision that was made by Trump to close the U.S. Agency for International Aid.
Exactly, yeah.
The U.S., and we all know what we think of the U.S., but the U.S. Agency for International Development was funding half of the Sudan international humanitarian response. So that response is already insufficient. Now, let's try to think about this with half of the funding being cut. It's always the same people that will end up suffering from it, always, over and over. And it is fascism and racism in its kind of rawest form right there that we are witnessing.
And I just very briefly, I just wanted to say that, like, I think also there's, just talking to a lot of people, there is also a need is the amount of humanitarian aid is one aspect, different strategies in different places is another aspect. But I think, there is a real call and a real need for people to rebuild their livelihoods, even in the context of this crisis, right? So I think one of the things many people are asking for is for the means to try to build a level of self-sufficiency again, if it's not complete. But rather than getting charity, people really want help with the means of they have the power, they have the skills, they have the work ethic to be able to do this, but they are kind of constantly kept in a position of being recipients. And I think this is something that's extremely important, this kind of division in the international sphere of development versus humanitarian and all of this. The reality is, regular people don't think like that. They know that, okay, I can sell falafel, I can do this, I can do that. And there's just very little support for people to actually be able to do that in the places where they can, work, where there's a level of stability, where they're able to be out on the street. And despite that, there are still so many people out on the streets. But of course, it's always the poorest that also get affected, because they're out there on the street. It's a woman selling tea or doing something, and if there's a violence on the street, she's going to be the first person to experience it, right?
Absolutely. Looking at the time, thank you so much. And yes, I mean, I could also go on forever and ever on this, but it is a colonial legacy that penetrates and underpins the international humanitarian system, whereby a lot of the systems deprive affected populations of their agency and do not consider them as agents of their future and as human beings with an intelligence and a desire and incredible capacities and bravery. I totally agree with this. So I'm gonna now turn to each of you with the last question, which is essentially, how can we help? We being non-Sudanese, having listened to you, having learned a lot more about the conflict and its dynamics and its underpinnings. And there's a question in the chat about this, but, you know, what forum can take international solidarity with you? What is the advice that you would give to people like us who don't want to just finish this conversation having learned about it, which is one thing, but really want to be able to do something about it? So I'll turn to Maz, Mohammed, and then Sarah to give us that, and then we'll go through a couple of questions on the chat. Maz, over to you.
Thank you. Well, first, Sarah, that was really powerfully stated. Thank you so much. I do agree there is a failure, and there is a moral failure of engaging with the conflict in Sudan. And yeah, so that's really powerful. And thank you so much for putting that so eloquently. I will keep it very short, and because of the nature of the work that I do, I engage directly with civil society organizations in Sudan, but also with donors. And as Sarah mentioned, that the emergency response room, they're not just there to respond for aid, but also they've been, and connections has been made by Mohammed earlier as well. They are the resistance committee. They are central to civil society and the revolutions. They've been the one who are leading and coordinating humanitarian assistance and cohesion works and all of that. But they also have been excluded from decision making. Fund has been centralized by international donors and have been poorly managed as well, and excluding civil societies from that. They are the one who are responding to that, but they are not being given the resources. They've not been well resourced and brought to decision-making spaces to influence policies and change. So my call is for any connections. If you work for any international organizations, if you have any access to policies, to change, to policymakers, to decision makers, influence this practice. And we've been, one obvious thing to highlight here is localizations or locally led, focusing on that. It's still really weak. It's still not engaging better. It's still not funding directly grassroots organizations to respond to the conflict meaningfully and giving them the means and the agency that they deserve to respond to conflict. I think also one call is not to, the situations is in Sudan is dire. That we're talking about sexual violence, we're talking about humanitarian crisis, but also we don't want to limit us to this kind of to just our struggle, right? There is a resistance, there is a movement building, there is great work that is being done. Support that. So we accept solidarity, we accept support, we accept meaningful structural support from the international community, but also we call for the Sudanese to be in the front line to receive that and to lead that.
Thank you, Maz. Very, very powerful. Thank you so much. Mohammed, over to you.
Yeah, that was, thank you, Maz. It was very, yeah. Sorry, I'm a loss of words because it's hard to fathom like the difficulty that we're facing. Sometimes we kind of try to tune it out. I think there's an old socialist slogan, which is that the enemy is at home. We've already learned so much about the various ways in which different countries and different places are implicated. Some of those places have vibrant civil societies, others like the UAE obviously less so. But you have to understand that the kind of solidarity we're asking is not like sympathy. It's mainly a recognition that our struggles are bound up in each other, and that just as in Khartoum, the capital and the tri-capital never imagined that a war of this scale would take place, and that there was a kind of, I hate to put it in this way, in a very crude way, passive indifference to the violence that was necessary in order for that center to be able to exist, that was out of sight and out of mind. I think that Sudan itself is a microcosm for the world, and the various ways in which the inability to address the root causes of the problems of the global economy deals with, and to scapegoat, blame migrants, etc. Building that kind of movement against that very concretely stops groups like the RSF from mushrooming. Building movements against resource extraction very concretely stops movements like the RSF or the M23 from growing. But more importantly, also is that both in exile and on the ground, regardless of who wins in this power struggle, there won't be much room for civil society left, much less society as a whole. The built environment is completely destroyed. The infrastructure is gone. People are starving. And then on top of that, civil society actors in either side are often accused of being collaborators with the other side, because both parties may be at a war against each other, but what they both agree on is that they have a historical enmity and almost see as an existential threat any existence of a civil society. And what we need more, how we get out of that, I don't know. But we need solidarity, and we need to understand that the everyday Sudanese person, despite all of the conditioning we've had to just assume, this is just an African conflict of those Black people killing those Black people over there, you have to see us in you, just as we see ourselves in you as well. And you have to be able to understand that our fates are bound up with each other. And this is not some kind of charity or even feeling sorry for us. So that's build strong movements against the far right and fascism is actually helps us a lot in Sudan as well.
Thank you, Mohammed. And you are speaking to the right crowd. I mean, France Insoumis is definitely doing that at the moment. Sarah, do you want, and just to flag this to the audience, we have put together resources that our guests have suggested. So they are in the link that's above in your screen. You can access all of the resources that's on media, that's on solidarity. All of this is in that link. Please come and have a look. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's already been said. I think one very important element is to understand that this conflict in Sudan is not unrelated to you. So it's not something happening far away that has nothing to do with you. So I would say the first thing I would ask people to do is to resist and hold their countries accountable for the role that they play, not just in Sudan, but in the DRC, in Palestine, across the whole of the global south. So I think this is the first aspect of it. There's a lot that can be done and very little that is. So we can talk about that. One way to start, because I know it's a very big thing, one way to start that is, if you haven't already done so, try to link up to Sudanese and other groups that are in your area, because often they have, we hold stands, we do events, and it's often just us there or others from countries like ours who feel what we're feeling. I think it's important that you link up. Just be careful, because there is a polarization happening within the Sudanese, also diasporas as well, that is really ugly at the moment, where you have this kind of SAF supporters, and I don't know, it's very, so really try to find a group that is not aligned with either. I would say that's very critical, and engage with them. I would say look into the gold issue. The UAE gets most of Sudan's smuggled gold, but it ends up in European markets and other markets. I know a group, for example, in Switzerland that's been working to understand how the gold ends up, Sudanese gold ends up in Switzerland. And they are doing, very good work locally on this. But I think looking at that issue, just take the issue of gold on its own already, I think there's a lot that can be done. So look at that as well. If you identify as a feminist, and especially as an intersectional feminist, I think there's an incredible amount of advocacy work that you can do to make visible and raise what is happening in Sudan, but also to support the local initiatives that are happening, from everything from providing just period pads to women in shelters, to helping with with mental health counseling for survivors of violence and so forth. There are also other groups like Save El Janena and others that have good presence online, that are working with communities from, for example, West Darfur, now displaced in Adri, who have suffered direct ethnic cleansing during this war. They have been targeted for ethnic cleansing, and they're trying to help people that have ended up in the camps in Adri, and they are there on Instagram as well. I really, I already plugged this, and I think it's one of the resources that we will share, but I think the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which was started by students, faculty, and others at the University of Toronto, but it's really expanded beyond. They're doing incredible work getting money to the Takaya, to the shared kitchens, and also to some of the emergency rooms. And it's really hard to get money into Sudan, and they put the infrastructure there to do that. And so it's a very simple way through PayPal to support them. And the last thing I'll say very briefly is there's a lot of work we need to do, not about this war, but a lot of solidarity work in relation to what happens after. So what I'm afraid of is that there's going to be a political settlement that very much looks like the political settlements we've had in the past, for example, in 2005, and that it's, you know, the resistance committees have been fighting against this closed door, bring the armed actors in and a few elites, civilian elites, shut the door, and then come up with a document that you sell to the Sudanese people, and pick the government, do all of this stuff. We have to resist this. We have to make sure that this does not happen again, because it just takes us into another cycle of war and violence. And the Sudanese people have had enough. They don't want any more war and violence. So we really have a lot of work to do. And so link up with us to see how we can work on this. Thank you so much. And I learned so much from all of you today. Thanks.
I think we all learned an incredible amount, and I'm really, really thankful to you guys. Yeah, it's always very inspiring to hear directly, and I know how tough it is to be living it, to be talking about it, to be repeating all of these things, but it is extremely helpful to us. We have put all of the resources you've given us into that link that we've popped in the chat, so I really encourage people to click on this. You'll have all of the links that Sarah has mentioned. There's a link to the Decolonial Center that Mohammed is the head of. Thank you again. We will organize other events of this kind. There might be something on DRC coming up, actually. So we will continue to hold roundtables of this kind, hearing from the very first people concerned. I cannot thank you enough for having taken the time. So again, thank you a million. And I hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you for holding the space very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.